Sam, and let me add my thanks to St. James's Church for hosting us, and thank you to all the LRB staff for your help and for your invitation. There's a number of slides that accompany this lecture, so orient yourself to a screen if you can. A band of light reflected across the waters of Morgan Lake, New Mexico, leads our eyes from the center foreground to a power plant on the Navajo reservation. The Four Corners power plant, one of the largest coal-fired generating stations in the United States. In this photograph, it is entirely in shadow, as dark as the more than 8 million tons of bituminous coal per year that fuels it. Morgan Lake is not a geological formation. It was built in 1963 to serve as a cooling pond for the plant, with water constantly replenished from the San Juan River. Through the play of light and shadow, DNA photographer Will Wilson visualizes in pixels what is not easily recognized in daily life, a narrative practice of connecting the dots. In this example of his work, light is reserved for the 3 rectangular waste ponds to the left, for the scar of the surface mine behind the plant, and ascending from the chimney carrying atmospheric depositions of mercury onto the Navajo Nation's land, animals, people, and water. Dark is the line of coal refuse, mimicking hills and mesas in shape and forming an intermediate horizon which cradles the power station. Dark, navy blue shadows of waste extend their reach across the photograph, just as the tentacles of toxicity spread into human and non-human communities and seep into groundwater. Toward the horizon stands the sacred shiprock, behind which are the Chushka Mountains. Vegetation is brown, roads, the edges of ponds, and the railway line from the mine to the power station appear scored into the landscape, razor-edged sharp. This is not the Morgan Lake of New Mexico tourist brochures and websites, where it is represented as a tempting cobalt blue, offering over 1,200 acres of wind surface, boating and fishing in water that is 75 degrees year-round. Wilson tells a very different story. This aquatic environment is uninviting, its palette of mineral grey evoking the hidden dangers to humans and wildlife that consume fish, along with aluminum particles, mercury, and selenium, among other contaminants. Swimming in the lake is banned. A forbidding presence, saturated in blue-grey, the power station seems to emerge from the mounds of toxic coal refuse, which leach iron, manganese, and aluminum residues. A weighty imposition on the landscape, an aberration rather than an integral part of it, the plant's massive solidity of steel, concrete, and brick contrasts dramatically to the fringe of sagebrush and pinyon pine along the shoreline, stubbornly clinging to life. The sky is ominous, permeated with washes of greys against the light. Its colour evokes pollution, rendering visible the emissions of nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide that cannot be seen, but that have penetrated the bodies of land, water, plants, animals, and humans for decades. In the bottom third of the image, the chimneys are reflected in the water, and the solidity of the power plant dissolves into grey streaks and ripples of movement. Can we imagine its disappearance, as we must imagine the disappearance of all coal-fired plants? The foreground provides the only warm colours in the image, a few splotches of madder brown and the sienna of grass fronds blowing in a wind. The warmth of these colours resonates with life, and I realise that here on the bank closest to us is the alternative meaning of plant, a generation of life as opposed to this form of energy production which extinguishes life by what Rob Nixon has described as a process of slow violence. The focus of my current project is contemporary artists whose work is pushing beyond conventional limits of form and media, breaking boundaries, crossing lines, and changing perspective to radically reconfigure ways of knowing and seeing from the scales of alternative, subversive cartographies and landscapes to intimate imaginings of the earth and of human and non-human bodies in relation. Whiteness from a distance. 50 Shades of Whiteness, according to the title. Whiteness revealed as ubiquitous and banal, its excess in its seepage beyond the black edges of the US. The more we look, the closer we move, the deeper we penetrate Jean Quick-to-See Smith's crafty layering, the more we uncover the creation of an elaborate fiction, a fiction which continues to exercise extraordinary, destructive power. From a distance, I was reminded of the maps that I first saw hanging on the walls of the various British classrooms I entered. Of course, the colour which occurred most often on British maps, atlases and globes of the world was red, not white. A difference in surface, but not in substance. For red then and white in this map signal the same thing. A celebration of power and domination rooted in imperialism, colonization, and indifference to the fate of the colonized. Jean Quick-to-See Smith is an enrolled Salish member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Nation. Her maps portray stolen lands. She deploys iconic shapes and objects in unexpected ways in her art, overturning settler colonial historical narratives of place, space, and being. Black paint outlines what would be recognizable to many on this earth as the United States of America, bordered by Canadian provinces to the north, the states of Mexico to the south, and in the Caribbean, Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, all of which are painted in solid colours of red, blue, orange, and yellow. The names which are currently allocated to states are absent, erased. In their place, Quick to See Smith has inserted typeset labels with names evocative of the white paint sold in hardware stores. They are wry, and they make me laugh in discomforting recognition. In what is now New England, where I live, Massachusetts is true white, New Hampshire, pure white, Vermont, extra white, and Maine, ultra white. Pennsylvania is, of course, antique white. Georgia is white peach, and Florida, white grapefruit. Quick to See Smith has also pasted typeset extracts from newspapers and included the sort of racist remarks too often overheard. Laid on Kansas, renamed White Corn, a white label reads, "Native Americans are those unrecognizable peoples who look Italian, Asian, or Greek, and everyone says, 'But you don't look Indian to me. I know because I've seen Indians in the movies.'" Unglamorous white, known now as California, is a related comment. American Indians in Hollywood movies come from Greece, Italy, Turkey, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Romania, Spain, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Kazakhstan, Tunisia, Libya, Mauritania, Israel, and Palestine. Euro-American cultural and racial authority, historical and cultural policies and attitudes toward indigenous peoples and cultures are exposed and undermined with irony and humor. Over Majestic Mountain, now known as Montana, Quick to See's homeland is pasted, "When the US government forbid tribes from dancing, drumming, and singing, the Salish decided to celebrate the nation's birthday on the 4th of July by dancing, drumming, and singing. The government found no way to say no to honoring the US." Simultaneously humorous and horrific, there is no beauty here. And yet, the brushstrokes of whites and creams fail in their attempt to obliterate the wide variety of shades of browns and black underneath. Tribal Map asserts the presence of living indigenous peoples in bold colours of depth and warmth. Here are lists of named communities that cannot be restrained within the boundaries and borders of settler colonization. Paint seeps, bleeds, and drips across black lines and borders in a refusal of their validity and in rebellion against their imposition. Of state names, Quick to See Smith says, she eliminated all trace of European presence, eliminating all the European names of states and keeping only the states that have Native American names, because this whole place was ours until the Great Invasion came. Boundaries that are arbitrary, boundaries that fail to acknowledge indigenous sovereignty, are boundaries obscured by running, bleeding, dripping paint, thicker and more pronounced than in tribal map. Expectations are interrupted. It takes work to uncover not only what is present, but what is missing or obscured, and why. The painting preserves the etymology of the names of Canadian provinces and US and Mexican states. The only names that remain visible are those that originate from one of the indigenous language groups. Borders, including between Canada, the USA, and Mexico, disappear under the spreading liquid of blues and greens with residual blood reds and oranges. State names is a muted history set starkly against a void. It is beautiful and heartbreaking. In a recent work, Quick to See Smith has completely dislodged the sighting of the landmass of the USA, turning it 90 degrees anti-clockwise, undermining even her own relationship with the presumptive power of maps. In several paintings from 2021, Quick to See Smith surrounds her maps with designs from plateau basketry and beadwork. In the process of making these maps, she recalls that she felt afraid because the land masses she created in the paintings were not only totally surrounded by native design, but were embodied by indigeneity, and felt too disorienting and subversive for viewers to initially comprehend. Inserted into Stolen Map is explicit reference to the historical power of the cartography which it subverts. Quote, "Maps have been the weapons of imperialism." The work of the Cloud Studies Unit of the Forensic Architecture Research Agency, based at Goldsmiths, has stretched my thinking about the representation of clouds in art beyond the emblematic to a consideration of their use as evidence. Airborne toxins like the colored smoke in a wind tunnel highlight the dynamics of power. Toxic clouds colonize the air we breathe across different places and durations, from the incident to epochal latencies. Both Jean Quick to See Smith, her painting here, Smoke Signals, and the photograph, Altered Landscape 12, by Tiwa Hopi artist Michael Naminga, use color, shape, and movement to capture multiple dimensions of colonization through toxic air in the clouds of smoke from the huge fires associated with climate change. Quick to See Smith also negotiates a variety of temporal scales, insisting that the past is also the present, in her inclusion of traditional textiles, indigenous images, and use of language. The humorous double meaning of smoke signals in the post "climate change is giving us smoke signals" and the settler colonial theft of Turtle Island is deemed a crime scene. This past present imperils the future. Manifest Destiny, Onward to Mars, denounces the hubris and the financial ambitions of Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson to profit from the colonization of space for tourism, and Elon Musk's appalling desires to colonize Mars. Smith's dislodged landmass in smoke signals is almost awash in a future of coastal flooding. Entire unnamed states, Texas, Florida, Maine, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and large swaths of the Northwest are inundated. Smith's area of dark red is not smoke, but a different type of toxic air. The largest methane gas cloud in North America, measured by the European Space Agency. Methane is an odorless, colorless gas, only viewed by infrared imaging or cameras. Yellows and reds indicate higher than normal anomalies, with more intense colors showing higher concentrations. The Four Corners area, the area where Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah meet, is the only red spot on the map. In this photograph, Michael Naminga has used yellows and reds to make visible the methane above the Navajo Nation and bordering the Apache Reservation. Naminga's Altered Landscape series consists of abstract, photography-based works that juxtapose geometric shapes in bright neon colors against black and white aerial landscapes from the Four Corners region. As Naminga describes it, the shaped aspect of his work stems from his frustration with photography being confined to the expected formats of a square or a rectangle. He challenges and forcefully disrupts these expectations, distorting photographic images as drilling and fracking cleave the crust of the earth. His compositions are mounted to shaped plexiglass and are two-dimensional, but they create the illusion of being three-dimensional. Shadow makes it appear as if the photograph is separated from, rather than mounted on the wall. Naminga wants the viewer to move around the image like they would move around a piece of sculpture, and to note how the image appears to expand or contract. Perspective changes, layers overlap, landscape fractures. In future work, I want to place Naminga's visual altered landscape series in conversation with the literary landscape of N.K. Jemisin in her Broken Earth trilogy, where the act of narration reproduces and mimics fractured geological formations. Both artists experiment with form and perspective, literally shifting the ground on which conventional expectations of photography and narrative rest as we move around and within their severed landscapes. Jemison destabilizes the reader as Naminga destabilizes the position of the viewer in their encounter with multiple and singular perspectives, either allied with or torn asunder by systems of power and exploitation hidden at the heart of the geological and political stabilization and continuity of planetary existence. Indigenous futurisms, originally coined in a literary context, has become increasingly present in the world of Indigenous art as practitioners seek ways to transcend the limits of binary thought inherent in the traditional versus modern dichotomy that stifles alternative imaginings of temporal juxtaposition. Because, he says, people don't usually think of native folks and then the future in the same breath, Diné artist Will Wilson says, he finds the concept useful as a destabilizing term. A younger generation of Indigenous artists, the students he teaches, talk about their practice as remembering the future. Memory is being understood and evoked not only as an individual and/or collective communal experience, but practiced, enacted as a narrative form, a technique, and a strategy. The terms Wilson uses most often to describe himself is a trans-customary Diné artist. As anthropology and other Western disciplines have situated Indigenous cultural practice as either traditional or contemporary, he explains trans-customary is the idea that there is a grey space, a spectrum. Work that we make today is informed by tradition, but tradition is ever evolving. You can have both traditional and contemporary influences informing one another through practice. Wilson's work responds to the ways in which photography has been used as a mechanism of colonization. He seeks to indigenize the form, practice, and process of the medium. Photography as a scientific means of categorization, he argues, cannot be separated from the history of the social, political, economic, and ecological colonization of native North Americans, because it has been used to classify and reinforce theories of racial superiority, which strengthened anthropological discourse, positioning American Indians as primitive others. In 2013, the Denver Art Museum exhibited Autoimmune Response, Weaving Sacred Mountains, referred to by its creator, Will Wilson, as Autoimmune Response, East, South, West, and North. The work consists of 4 individual beaded panels or weavings that he has integrated into his multimedia autoimmune response project, AIR, an allegorical investigation of the extraordinarily rapid transformation of Indigenous lifeways, the disease it has caused, and strategies of response that enable cultural survival. The practice of remembering the future is embodied in Wilson's description of himself as a trans customary DNA artist. The 4 beadwork panels symbolize the 4 sacred mountains of the Diné Bikayar, the sacred and ancestral homeland of the Navajo Nation, and simultaneously evoke indigenous futurism through a synthesis of art and technology. Each panel is a different color, each referencing a different mountain. The traditional weaving practices of generations of women in Wilson's family are a portal to his post-apocalyptic vision. Embedded as part of the beadwork are QR codes, which act as multimedia codices, allowing the viewer access to their content. When the code is scanned by an appropriate smartphone or other capable device, it takes the viewer to a video of the autoimmune response protagonist, traversing each region's landscape related to the geographic site. Autoimmune response, AIR, 2004 to 2021, is a continually evolving project of more than 65 integral and related artworks, which has generated another series called Connecting the Dots. Wilson has chosen photographic locations chiefly from the Diné Tar, which translates roughly as among the people, the ancestral homelands of the Diné, and the Navajo Indian Reservation within it. Lands in the Four Corners region of the US, now known as northwestern New Mexico, southwestern Colorado, southeastern Utah, and northeastern Arizona. Beginning in the 1930s, there were increasing federal incursions into Diné life, land, and resource use. Navajo land was extensively surveyed and mapped by various arms of the federal government. The US Soil Conservation Service determined that the land that had long sustained the Diné was unsuitable as pasture for their livestock, and the service instituted a brutal stock reduction program, forcibly slaughtering hundreds of thousands of sheep. Instead, the land was defined as, quote, materially and ideologically suited for extractive industrialism, end of quote. Mineral, oil, and mining surveys escalated. Surveyors, prospectors, mine operations, and millers invaded Diné Bikayar. The Navajo Nation eventually became the battery powering cities in Arizona, California, and Nevada, the source of power for the Cold War weapons industry and for commercial nuclear power. In short, the nation was central to the nuclear industrial complex. The legacy has been death and disease. The byproducts of uranium and coal mining and their processing, of nuclear weapons production facilities, and from atomic test sites are irradiated landscapes and exposure to contaminated air, water, housing, animals, vegetation, and soil. As mines, mills, nuclear facilities, and weapons production sites have been abandoned, it has become clear that cleaning up radioactive and toxic wastes are so expensive that it may never be accomplished. As early as 1988, engineers at the Energy Department were using the term national sacrifice zones without referring to who exactly was to be sacrificed. There are over 500 abandoned mines on the Navajo Nation. AIR is an alternative cartography, contesting the maps of surveyors, prospectors, mine operations and millers that colonize space for resource extraction. Some of his locations disrupt settler colonial ways of seeing and knowing, embodied in places that have become icons of the global tourist industry. This photograph, for example, destabilizes the comforting familiarity of the Grand Canyon, not only because the three figures on the rim of the canyon are all wearing breathing apparatus, but also because, as Wilson describes, they are looking over the confluence of the Little Colorado and Colorado rivers below from the Navajo Nation side of the Grand Canyon, a perspective that not a lot of people see because it is remote and you have to travel through a lot of Navajo land to get there. The story here is not the disengagement of the stranger, but of family, home, and a relationship to the land over multiple generations. This place is close to where Wilson's family had their winter sheep camp. Through metaphorical self-portraits created using terrestrial and aerial photography, Wilson's cartography reveals radioactive geographies. He has photographed, among others, the disposal site for radioactive tailings relating to copper and uranium mining near Mexican Hat in Utah, and managed by the United States Department of Energy. Hydraulic fracking operations at Aneth, Utah, and the White Mesa uranium mill operated by Energy Fuels at White Mesa, Utah. July the 16th, 1945. August the 6th, 1945. August the 9th, 1945. These dates haunt the first photograph in the Autoimmune response series. They are a measure of continuity with the primary characteristics of Western imperialism, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism. The profound disregard for human and non-human forms of life. The willingness to embrace mass death and environmental and ecological destruction. As Achille Mbembe observes, in its dark underbelly, modernity has been an interminable war on life. These dates also augured a future, a massive increase in the rate of resource extraction, and the beginning of the nuclear age of weaponry and energy production, during which the federal government and mining companies rendered the DNA exploitable and expendable laboring bodies. In short, waste. Autoimmune response is a performative and installation project. Wilson writes that the series takes as its subject the quixotic relationship between a post-apocalyptic Diné Navajo man and the devastatingly beautiful but toxic environment he inhabits. Wilson characterizes the series as an allegorical investigation of the extraordinarily rapid transformation of indigenous lifeways, the disease it has caused, and the strategies of response that enabled cultural survival. If the work confronts us with a post-apocalyptic future, then it is a future ground in the long history of the contamination of the Southwest, which constitutes the present. A panorama, Erewhon is almost mural-like, an inkjet print. The original measures more than 114 inches, almost 3 meters in length. This is a landscape as a vast, ominous expanse, eerie in atmosphere, apocalyptic in scale, segmented by a barbed wire fence which marks the horizon. Into the left side, Wilson has composited the Trinity explosion, which rises and, in reflection on a liquid surface, descends through light on either side of the horizon. Into the left side, the composition of light and shadow, the very carefully controlled exposure, capture other cloud towers and their reflections to the right, cloud forms that resemble or echo those that rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How to render visible what travels through the air? How to see what is invisible to the eye? I have been talking as if these cloud formations are only symbolic, but in Wilson's work, clouds are exposed as evidence. They are environmental and political. They are lethal. Wilson places himself in the series as the Diné man we know only as the protagonist. The artist performs a post-apocalyptic Navajo man's journey through a vacant world, a survivor placed in landscapes of detritus and decay. In Erewhon, there are 2 images of Wilson, though the protagonist is frequently doubled and sometimes trebled in other photographs. This profile of the protagonist in the foreground is the only image in the entire series where we see him without a mask and breathing apparatus. A portrait superimposed against and seemingly somewhat apart from the landscape, Wilson, as Diné artist and performer, wears a crisp white shirt and has hair tied back in a traditional Navajo bun. An expression of serious determination and deep thought suggests contemplation of the enormity of the project ahead, a cognitive mapping and consideration of the questions that will propel the protagonist forward and into multiple roles as time traveler, explorer, scientist, hero, and potential healer. Where is everyone gone? What cataclysm has transformed the familiar and strange landscape that he wanders? Why has the land become toxic to him? How will he respond, survive, reconnect to the earth? I show this detail to make it easier to see the protagonist inside the fence, beginning his journey and wearing the face mask and breathing apparatus that will become his signature costume. He is doubled by this mirrored landscape, his right arm lifted in a dine gesture of sprinkling pollen, a ritual of blessing and of healing. How to think and how to represent that which has vast spatial and temporal variance in scale. It was clear by 1970 that the uranium industry was producing a devastating, deadly epidemic of a variety of forms of cancers and other radiation-related diseases, not limited to men and women working for the mines and mills, but having effects outside of the industry. Radioactive geographies have been difficult to map spatially and temporally at a variety of scales, from the scale of Dine Bikayar to the more local scales, where the risk of contamination from individual tailings piles move with the rain, wind, and animals. Toxic contamination is ubiquitous, found in the building materials of homes and at the most intimate scale of all, in the cells and organs of bodies. How to measure the timescales of uranium exposure from the penetration of the cells of bodies, human and non-human, to the millennia of potential contamination. Uranium toxicity has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. These are the temporalities that haunt Wilson's project. The title, Autoimmune Response, references not only the causal relations between the toxicity of the environment and human diseases where the immune system attacks the body, but also to how environmental pollution is causing an autoimmune response in the planet itself. In Air 5, the figure is twinned, evoking the hero twins of the Navajo creation story. Wilson, doubled, is in the foreground, head and shoulders at a 45-degree angle, heads turned outward from the photograph, bloodshot eyes looking accusingly out, implicating the viewer. Who will accept responsibility? The tubes of their breathing apparatus seem to curl and flap uselessly and appear to be attached to each other's masks. There are no oxygen tanks. Are they breathing each other's exhalations? Their hair, faces, shirts, and masks are covered in what we imagine to be radioactive dust, ash. Are we looking at humans who have been rendered disposable, waste, against a liquid leached out contaminated landscape? Are we looking at a death sentence, a planetary death in a palette of red, white, and blue? The two figures are sharply defined, exposed in multiple ways. Their eyes stare, demanding recognition, a witnessing, a reckoning. In his book, Our History is the Future, Nick Estes, an enrolled member of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe and professor of history and American Indian studies, has issued a call to not just imagine, but to demand the emancipation of the earth from capital. This is a multivalent politics of struggle that is also shaping artistic practice and the politics of narration. While continuing to complete his aerial photographic survey of the over 500 abandoned uranium mines located on the Navajo Nation, Will Wilson's latest iteration of the Immune Response series features an installation of a Hogan greenhouse entitled Autoimmune Response Lab, in which indigenous food plants are grown. Having focused so far on the toxic legacy of uranium extraction and processing on Diné, bearing witness to these sites and the frontline communities affected by them, Wilson is developing what he hopes will serve as a catalyst for designing innovative, interdisciplinary ways to understand what remediation can be and become. Wilson has installed his air lab in exhibitions as a post-apocalyptic take on the sacred Diné dwelling, the Hogan. For example, Wilson collaborated with the University of Utah's Red Butte Gardens to turn his steel Hogan into a greenhouse for growing the Four Corners potato and plant species that remove heavy metals and toxins from the soil. When the Hogan greenhouse was installed at the Visual Arts Center of the University of Texas, Austin, he partnered with Marica Alvarado, a Lipan Mescalero Apache medicine woman, founder of the Earth Institute of Indigenous Cultures and Teachings. Drawing upon Indigenous sciences and cultural knowledge, Wilson hopes that Air Lab will serve as a platform for voices of resilience, resistance, and vision for a transition to restorative systems of economy and memory making. He also wants the project to be a pollinator, expanding to create formats for community exchange and production that question and challenge the social, cultural, and environmental systems that surround us. Thank you.